I wouldn't exactly refer to my life as normal, but what happened over the last 3 weeks is beyond my wildest nightmares, especially now that I type it all out. About a month ago, my grandfather passed away at the age of 74 from an apparent heart attack. My father, his son, asked me to go oversee his estate while he was overseas on a business venture. My grandfather had a large, ranch-style cottage in the middle of a stretch of plains in southern Colorado. I had never known my grandfather very well. The only times I ever got to see him was when he would come by my house and stay a night or two for the occasional holiday. Still, I loved him regardless. Me being the college kid that was about to take his summer break, I agreed to watch the cottage, if for nothing else but to get away from the university, and left only 2 days after the end of my semester. My little off-campus apartment could wait. It was only a few weeks after all. The trip there was relatively uneventful. Drive to this airport, fly out to this one, wait a couple of hours, and take the final plane to the closest airport from the airport, some 80 miles away. The drive to the cottage was equally unassuming. Just miles of hills and grass, with the occasional mountain on the horizon. Still, I was excited to finally be out of that stuffy little college town. At least the air here didn't smell like gasoline and wet asphalt. When I finally pulled up to the cottage, I could barely tell if it was the right one. If it weren't for my grandfather's last name being printed on the mailbox by the dirt path leading up, I would have drove right by it. It was a medium-sized prairie home, with a faint, chipping blue paint on the wood siding that lined the sides of the house. Just to the side of the house was a big red barn, one that you would expect to see like in the movies. Always the red paint, I wonder why. The small ranch was fairly isolated. The dirt path that led away from the highway led on for at least a couple of miles before ending here at the cottage. I couldn't help but crack a small smile. It was just like my grandfather to keep to himself. I stepped on the covered porch and heard a deep creak in response. I heaved up my suitcase in one hand and approached the front door. I stopped for a minute and studied it. There were 3 long gashes in the door, each about a centimeter deep. It was as if an animal tried to claw its way into the house. I shook myself from my curiosity. Surely there were wolves out here, right? I pulled open the front door and it squealed a bit as it began to open up fully. The smell of the room suddenly hit me like a wave. The whole place smelled bad, but it was a faintly familiar smell. It had a smell similar to sulfur. Not exactly the most welcoming smell, but I pushed on anyway. It wasn't long before I was settled in. I quickly found myself in a state of boredom. What did Grandpa do out here anyway? My cell phone had reception, but strangely didn't have any internet. I decided that the novels I had brought with me were best saved for later. I poked around my grandfather's house to see if there was anything worthwhile. It wasn't long until I found an old radio sitting on the nightstand next to his bed. I was curious, so I tuned the old thing the best I could. I managed to find an old country music station, and the room filled with the shrill of a fiddle. I smiled again. Maybe a few weeks here wouldn't be so bad. I settled in for the night. I was suddenly awoken in my sleep by a loud howling. It seemed as if it were close. I peered out of the bedroom window to see the very wolves outside, maybe a couple 100 feet away from the porch, running through the grass away from the cottage. I gave a slight chuckle, remembering my close inspection of the scars on the front door. Yep, I laughed in spite of myself. definitely wolves. I fell back to sleep soon after. After a couple of rather uneventful days, I decided to check in with my father. I rang him up with my smartphone. "Hey buddy, what's up?" came my dad's voice from the phone. "Not a lot, to be honest. There isn't really much to do here, but I'm getting by. There's also this really bad smell that doesn't seem to go away." "Like sulfur?" my father responded. "Yeah, like sulfur," I conceded. "Well, your grandfather worked in a quarry for 20 years. They do say that smell never really goes away." "I guess not." The next day was equally uneventful. Another day of sitting around and reading novels, and another day of jamming out to old country hits. I started texting old friends, looking up fun recipes with the non-perishable supplies in the pantry. Anything to escape the boredom. I began to really wonder what Grandpa did to escape the monotony of living so far from civilization. I thought it to be a great idea to wander around the ranch property. Around back was a desolate field, like it was once used for planting in a bygone time. I then wandered over to the barn and pushed open the big door. The inside was large and mostly empty. It had seemed like there may have once been a second level, but it had long since been removed. Along with the floor was hay strewn about, with a couple of piles in the corners. Once again, my curiosity was captured. Why was there hay if there were no animals? One of the piles, however, seemed very strange. It had a flattened, pushed top, as if something had recently sat or laid in it. Out of curiosity, I reached out to touch it. It was warm. Someone had been here. I frantically shot out of the barn and ran around the sides. Where were they? Why were they here? Were they a squatter of some sort, taking advantage of a recently abandoned property? My search yielded no answers. They were simply gone. Shook up from the incident, I made my way back to the cottage and called my dad. I explained to him what happened and why I was so shook up. He explained to me that there was nothing to worry about, and that my grandfather used to keep some horses. That explained the hay. But he never did quite reassure me about what was in there. That night, I was suddenly awoken again. I stopped for a second, anticipating the same howls from a few nights before. But none came. Then the radio, still sitting on the nightstand next to the bed, crackled on. Static flooded through the receiver at first. I sat there, completely dumbstruck by what I had just witnessed. I sat there for a moment and attempted to rationalize the whole thing. Maybe it was just a faulty radio. Then a singing began to come through the radio. A soft woman's voice, faint, distant. It sounded like it was passionate, pained even. The words were incomprehensible. I stood up and approached the radio, slowly, cautiously. I reached down to the outlet and unplugged the radio. The singing continued. Not from the radio, but this time from outside the window. I froze. I had no idea what was going on. Terror flooded over me, and I began to slowly step back. I pulled back the curtains and dared a look out the window. I couldn't quite make out the whole lot, but I began to scan the front yard, sweeping my gaze across the property. Then I saw it. The silhouette of a woman against the moonlight. No, this was no ordinary woman. The limbs and torso were elongated and thin, like stretched bone. It, hunched over with intent. Even still, her figure had to be nearly 7 feet tall. I shut the curtain and stepped away from the window. Oh God, what do I do? My first thought was to call the authorities, if at the very least to explain an instance of trespassing. I called the emergency line. 911, what is your emergency? I believe there is a woman trespassing on my property. Sir, have you attempted to interact with this woman? No, I believe her to have some sort of malicious intent. An officer has been dispatched to take care of this situation. 20 minutes. 20 agonizing minutes of waiting in that damn room and waiting for the sirens. I tried to bring myself to look out the window again, but I couldn't make myself do it out of fear of what I would see. So I stared at the bedroom door and waited. When the officer finally showed up, the woman was, of course, nowhere to be found. I explained the situation to him in detail, even going so far as to give the abnormal description of the woman I had witnessed. He raised his eyebrows at me, his suspicion of the legitimacy of my story clear as day on his face. He jokingly asked me if I was prone to nightmares, but when he saw that I was not amused, he quickly backpedaled, stating that if there was anything else suspicious, to not be afraid to call. He was gone within another 5 minutes. Great. Several more days passed. Sleeping at night had become more of a chore because of that strange incident, but nothing had happened since. I was obviously less upbeat about the prospect of staying there for another week and a half, but I did not know what else I could do. I was the one entrusted to watch the estate. Maybe I could shrug off a few nightmares, right? That night, I woke up in the middle of the night again. And again, there was singing. This time louder, more clearer. It was coming from right outside the window. I pulled myself out of bed, the same familiar terror flooding around my body, but it was filled with a sick curiosity. I reached for the curtain and pulled it back. Oh my God. I closed the curtain quickly in a reaction of fear. She was just outside the window, on the porch. But that was no woman, not even close. Instead of a woman's face, I stared into an empty gaze. There were no eyes, only voids where eyes were supposed to be. The mouth was permanently fixed in a screaming expression, the skin looking blackened, twisted and burned. The stringy hair floated around the skeletal head. The skin of the lanky, slim limbs clung tightly to contorted bone. And that thing was just outside of my window. I ran and immediately locked the bedroom. The singing outside had stopped, this time replaced by shrills and frantic skittering. There were loud scratching noises coming from where the front door was. Desperate, long scratches that audibly ripped away wood from the front door. She's trying to claw her way in. Frantically, I barricaded the bedroom door with the little furniture in the room. I reached for my phone and immediately rang for the police. Another agonizing 20 minutes. This time the scratching continued. The shrills outside became more desperate. I had never been more terrified in my life. I heard the front door begin to crack, ready to give in, and sirens. Thank God. The scratching stopped, and I could hear the thing skitter off the porch and listen to it becoming more faint. The officer took me more seriously this time. How could he not? The front door was now completely splintered, barely still staying on the hinges. I could still tell, however, that he doubted the truth of what he was seeing. He called for an additional car, and together they did a deep search of the perimeter. Of course, they came up with nothing. Now, taking my claim seriously, I helped him fill out a report of the situation. He recommended that I be cautious. Right, as if I didn't know that already. Again, I watched him drive away. I slept in a barricaded room that night. A few more nights passed. Now, it was only 3 days before my father returned from overseas. I thought many times about telling him about the situation. But if I couldn't explain the situation to the police, who had witnessed what had happened to the front door, how could I convince someone of the same fact half the world away? Regardless, I had one resolution. I had to leave, and soon. That day, I decided to call it quits. I couldn't just wait for the thing to come back. I went out to my car and put in the key. I turned it, but instead of the roar of the engine, I was met with a pathetic sputtering before shocked silence. I went outside to the front and the hood of the car to try to determine the issue. I opened it up. The battery wires were cut, or rather, slashed. Then, a repeated shrill came from the thick wilderness of the trail leading back to the highway. It was a mockery of laughter. It was toying with me, daring me to make a run for it. I made a break for the house, and even though I didn't hear anything following, I kept sprinting. Rushing past the kitchen, I ripped open a drawer and picked out the largest kitchen knife I could find. I barricaded what remained of the front door, then barricaded myself once more in the bedroom. I once again broke out my trusty cell phone, dialed 911 and... no answer. I was awestruck. I could not believe it. I tried again. No answer. I tried to reach my father with similar results. I sat there. A whirlwind of fear, anger, and imminent doom swirled around my head. I cried for a long time, completely helpless. Nightfall came not too long after. I sat on the bed, staring at the bedroom door. A sick sense of anticipation filled my body. It was coming. I know it. There was nothing I could do about it. Then the singing started once more. This time I could make out the words. It was my name, over and over, sung out in a long melody so as to not be clear. I realized now what it was. It wasn't just some arbitrary song. It was calling me. Then the scratches started once more. Slow this time, less desperate. It knew it had all night. So I sat there for hours, listening to the scratching. The shrills became twisted cackles as the front door finally gave in to the monster. I heard it skitter to the bedroom door. Suddenly, the smell that I'd been so accustomed to had become more intense. Sulfur. Dear God, it was coming from the creature. It must have been in the house before. Maybe my grandfather's death wasn't as natural as we all thought. Suddenly, the thing broke through a piece of the bedroom door, its claws finally breaking through to the other side of the doorknob. Seeing the opportunity, I raised the large kitchen knife and brought it down on that twisted claw. It went right through the hand and stuck in the door. The thing was completely unfazed. It was as if it wasn't there and I'd swung the knife at open air. The creature leaned down and stared at me through that hole with the same empty, haunting gaze that I had met with nights before. I was petrified with fear, managing to only get out a single word. Why? It seemed to like that. It gave a couple mocking chuckles and pulled back from the hole, gave a cackling shrill, and scattered out the front door. That was last night. Now it has become more brave. I heard the shrills all day, all surrounding the house. I can't leave. I'm trapped, stuck, like wounded prey, waiting for the predator to end the game. Make it stop, please. I know it's playing with me now. Waiting. Just waiting. I don't know what to do. Oh God. I'm sorry. As much as I would like to think that I'm going to be okay, the dark reality of my situation sets in further. I still have the kitchen knife. The closer the shrills get, the more uncertain I get. What do I do? What can I do? Should I try to fight it again? Should I get out of this nightmare right now? I don't know. I'm sorry. That's strange. The shrills have stopped, but I can hear skittering. Closer. Ever closer. The scratching has started again. Forgive me.